Hello, welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. I am incredibly honored and underqualified to be hosting today's guest, which has never stopped a male podcaster before. So I am summoning my best Theo Vaughn, Joe Rogan bravado to welcome Lyle Jeremy Rubin. If you watched or listened to episode 3, War is Romantic, you'll recognize him as the author of Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body, A Marine's Unbecoming. He served for 5 years in the United States Marine Corps, including in Afghanistan, has a PhD in history, so is truly a perfect guest to break down today's myth, war keeps us safe. So please welcome Lyle Rubin.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Let's get right into it. You've been to Afghanistan. You have a doctorate. So yes or no question, does war keep us safe?
No,
Yeah.
I'm going to keep it simple on that one.
Excellent. Done. Easy. So yeah, I'm
Yeah.
going to end the recording. We did it.
Us Marines are very efficient.
Yes. I'm super impressed. So
Yeah.
here we go. How would you describe your politics going into the Marine Corps, and how would you describe your politics coming out?
Yeah. So, I guess in order to talk about my politics before the Marine Corps, I kind of have to talk about my childhood and my upbringing and my overall background. So I came from a liberal Jewish family in New England, in Connecticut. And I kind of rebelled against my liberal family and my liberal upbringing. We can get into this a little bit more. There are reasons why I rebelled. I talk about like sexual violence among peers, high school peers of mine. So I just immediately started gravitating toward a kind of like hyper masculine, I guess today some would say toxic masculine version of manhood. And then 9/11 happened 2 weeks into my undergraduate tenure, and that just also dramatically changed the way I looked at the world, and I ended up becoming a pro-war voice on campus. I was an opinions editor at the school newspaper. I was a co-founder of the political magazine on campus. And then by my junior year, sometime around there, I decided, since I was supporting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, then I would have to actually put on a uniform, um, and and follow through on my convictions.
And that's proof that that was before podcasting, because today I feel like you would have just the equivalent of putting your money where your mouth is just starting a podcast. So
Yeah,
you actually went and
yeah.
did it.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. Still very guilty about my decision, as comes through time and again in my book and my other writings. But yeah, so I think, the moment I started my military process, I went to officer candidate school, and I had a terrible time there. I was physically fit, I was academically sound, but I just wasn't ready for the culture at all. And it was at a time when the colonel, the commanding officer at Officer Candidate School in Quantico, was basically disobeying orders from the civilian leadership that wanted to pump out a lot of officers and a lot of lieutenants, because we were fighting a two-front war at the time, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we needed a lot of lieutenants. And he actually disobeyed direct orders, and the attrition rate was just ridiculously high. So whenever they targeted someone, they basically just sleep deprived you until you could no longer function. And that's what happened to me. I was literally hallucinating at one point.
Holy shit.
It was a terrible experience. I didn't quit. The first 5 weeks, you have an opportunity to quit. If you quit, then you might not be invited back. So I just kept on suffering for weeks on end. And then I did get kicked out the 5th week. Terrible experience. To make a long story short, I didn't end up going back to officer candidate school at first. I went to boot camp instead. So I for those of you listeners who might not be familiar, militaries around the world and throughout history are basically 2-tier structures. Originally, it was like a very strict kind of class society. You had the wealthy, who were the officers, and then everyone else, the hoi polloi, were all enlisted. And it's a little different now because there are, you know, not so wealthy officers, and then there's some wealthy enlisted, but for the most part, that class dynamic is held. And so I had a unique experience of, came from a comfortable home, but went enlisted for a bit because of this initial terrible experience at officer candidate school. And I'm just saying all this because it helps answer your original question that, like, this initial shock, it was a real humbling for me, just right from the beginning. I've been used to, getting my way for the most part. I'd been used to, living a relatively charmed life, and suddenly I was failing at everything I did, and I was being brutalized in ways. I mean, I guess you could say in high school, the sexual violence, was a form of brutalization, but this was maybe like an even more intense form in some ways, or a continuation of that. And it did end up humbling me. And as early as the entry level training, I was already having pretty substantial doubts about not only my decision, but about, the politics that had brought me there.
And this
Yeah,
is 2006-ish, you're 21.
yes, yes. So this was, I actually, incidentally, I went to boot camp on literally June 6th of 2006. And I remember all of us were saying 666, the day of the devil. And
Wow.
Marines are called devil dogs. So we thought this was a very auspicious start for our careers in the Marines. So it's a very easy date to remember. But yes, so I actually went to officer candidate school before then, but I officially became a Marine once I made it through boot camp. Um, and, for me, there was the culture shock of just kind of, I was somewhat rare as like a true believing Marine who came in for, I came in for all sorts of reasons, but I did come in for political reasons. I really believed in the mission, and I believed in like the idea of nation building. And I believed that we were really bringing democracy and freedom to parts of the world that didn't have those things. I mean, I was really naive in that sense. And it's very hard to go through this entry level training as a thoughtful person and not come out the other side wondering if the culture that you're being inculcated in is at all compatible with bringing democracy or freedom to another people. Because at the end of the day, it's all about killing. It's all about desensitizing your capacity to empathize with others and to activate the cruelest and most aggressive parts of yourself, both individually and as a collective. And what I came to learn, and in some ways I came to learn quite early, even before I went to Afghanistan, is that that is incompatible with bringing freedom and democracy to another people, much less ensuring freedom and democracy at home, which is something else we can talk about.
Yes, I hope so. And did you learn anything about the Afghan people as part of training, or it was strictly physical? Did they say, yeah, what were the means by which you were told that you can build nations?
Yeah, so I would say that there was a difference between our training at Paris Island, which was enlisted, and then my officer candidate school, which I did end up going back to a year and a half later, and I made it through the second time. The major difference is on the officer side, you did get some real classes on cultural awareness training of some kind. So, but it was very much a check in the box. No one was paying attention. No one really cared. Even the people giving us these classes didn't care. Some of them even made fun of what they were saying. They would. There's kind of this meta conversation they were having with themselves and with us, being like, "Well, I have to say this. This is my job to say this." But at the end of the day, it's about getting some. It's about killing. So you had that, and then I would say at the boot camp level, I mean, there was just none. There was no cultural awareness whatsoever. In fact, and this I write about this in the book, and when I do counter recruitment, when I go to schools and I speak to heavily targeted students who are being, heavily recruited, I always bring up this story that we spent hours on end learning how to use a bayonet and the last bayonet charge was the Korean War. It was in 1953.
Wow.
And none of us got issued bayonets when we got deployed. So the logic behind this, and there's many books actually that have been written about this, is that this was a kind of training that was established after the Vietnam War. I'm sorry, after World War II, because they had high level generals and civilian leaders had determined that the majority of frontline troops were not firing directly at the enemy, that they were either not firing at all, or they would fire to the left or the right of the enemy, or above or below the enemy. There was a psychological blockage that made it very difficult for most of these draftees and conscripted, soldiers and Marines to actually fire directly at the enemy. So they introduced a whole new training regimen that was all about dehumanizing, this amorphous force abroad that we would be tasked with policing and killing. And bayonet training became a major part of that, where we just spent hours on end stabbing a stack of tires in the woods and just saying in unison, kill, 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 Haji, kill, 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 Haji, kill, 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 Haji. Haji is a term of respect among Muslims. It means one who makes the holy pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. Obviously, it was a derogatory term for us, and it's a term that stuck with us throughout our rest of the time in the Marine Corps, certainly the rest of my time in the Marine Corps, and it's what we called the people we ended up policing and killing in Afghanistan. We either called them Hajis or Talibs. So the answer to your question is no. And in fact, it was the opposite, where we were not only not being trained to kind of learn the real history of these peoples that we were supposedly saving or protecting, but we were actually taught to drain them of any residual humanity whatsoever from the very beginning.
And when did you get to Afghanistan? When you got there and presumably weren't greeted as a liberator, like the scene in Game of Thrones when I think it's the SOC people hold up Khaleesi and thank her for their freedom.
Yeah. I mean, I ended up, it was a long process for me, very complicated Marine experience in general, but I did end up in Afghanistan early 2010. This is the height of President Obama's surge. General McChrystal had basically, there's a lot that's been written about this, a lot of movies, that have kind of captured this moment, but McChrystal basically outgamed Obama and kind of backhandedly got Obama to commit hundreds of thousands of troops to Afghanistan in 2010. So it was a major surge. And the kind of main effort of this surge was the Marines in the southern part of the country, particularly in Helmand Province, in and around Helmand Province. That's where I was deployed. That's where my Marines were deployed. I had a very kind of dichotomous deployment experience, particularly the first 6 months, where I was both the assistant officer in charge. So I was either hanging out at a big regimental base with a nice chow hall and air-conditioned tents and just overall like relatively high levels of amenities. And then I would often leave the regimental base to visit a number of my team Marines who were attached to frontline units, infantry units, reconnaissance units, sometimes even special forces units, but mostly infantry and other combat arms, conventional units. And I would visit them. I would occasionally go on foot patrols with them. I would occasionally run vehicle mobile operations with them. And I would spend weeks on end with them while many of their friends were going out on these patrols, these missions, and getting blown up in IEDs. Sometimes there would be pretty major firefights, but I would say it was mostly IEDs that were killing everyone, both ourselves and, I should say, local Afghans on the other side who were also landing on these IEDs at times. And, much like my boot camp experience, I mean, it was somewhat instant that it was this obvious kind of realization that the people did not want us there, that they were suspicious of us, that many of them were working both sides, not because they were duplicitous, but because they had no choice. The only way they could survive is by saying yes to everyone who wandered into their village any given moment, whether it was us, whether it was the Afghan army that we were supporting, whether it was coalition forces, or whether it was insurgents and members of the previous Taliban government. Um, so and a lot of most of the frontline guys that I worked with, including my own, and then also the people they were supporting. I mean, hardly any of them. I don't remember a single person who believed in the mission. I
Wow.
mean, by the time I was showing up on these frontline bases, the running kind of like sardonic joke or overall mood was like, we're doing all of this for no reason. Like, the people hate us. We're going to lose this war. Uh, and there's different places you can go with that. I mean, I don't want to pretend that everyone had my politics. Most people on the front lines did not have my politics, and they don't have my politics today either. Um, but there was a fundamental agreement that the people did not want us there, and that the mission was totally lost and aimless. And to the extent that people were motivated to go out there on these foot patrols and these other missions, it was not because of the flagpole mission. It wasn't because what the generals and colonels were talking about back at the big bases, or what the civilian leaders were talking about back in Washington. It was because some of their friends had already been severely hurt and killed, and they wanted revenge. It was because they had been trained to kill, and they wanted to do their job, which they had become very good at. Um, and for some of them, you had all different kinds of front line. I mean, the military is truly, in a lot of ways, a cross section of America. So you have all different kinds of people. Some of the people like killing. So there was a real nihilism that I ran into at times, combined with everything else. I mean, you had a lot of people like me that didn't want to go out anymore. They thought it was not only a waste, but an abomination that we were still going out for no good reason. Um, and then you had a lot of people in between that knew that the mission was lost, but still felt some obligation to do their jobs because they had some kind of patriotic feeling that this was still what they had been called to do. So they're going to do it even if they disagree with the overall mission. But yeah, again, I mean, I was writing, once I was getting back to the big bases, I would send emails off to like family and friends. And it's very clear early on in my writings that the only thing that was motivating me at that point was to basically be there for my own guys. Um, and, and I write about this in the book too. After I got out of the Marine Corps, I met a lot of conscientious objectors. I did a lot of activist work with a lot of people that had, I think, in a lot of ways been far more courageous than me, and had made decisions to basically remove themselves from these missions. And I told myself at the time that, the way I justified not doing that is that if I remove myself, then I'm basically just abandoning all my guys that I helped train up, and they're in danger. And this is what I told myself. I'm not saying that it was a noble answer, but it was certainly my own self-rationalization at the time.
No, yeah, absolutely makes sense. It's so interesting. That, yeah, no, in America, any sort of solidarity without weaponry, that's socialism. But no, you gotta, the importance of the camaraderie, from everything I've read, is like truly a powerful animating force. And as someone who was out there, so for the young people listening to this and just know President George W. Bush as like that painter guy who gave Michelle Obama some candies at a funeral and is now being profoundly rehabilitated. Like, what's it like seeing, even though that you were there under Obama, but the guy who set this in motion now become just another cutie patootie old man? Like, an interesting thing is how it's now widely accepted. Even the current president says, yeah, those wars were stupid, but doesn't, not enough to hold anyone accountable or to, change course and not make the exact same mistakes in other countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's become increasingly clear to most Americans that we have a major accountability crisis among our political class, our ruling class, our media class. They all fail upward. And in fact, in some ways, the more they fail, the more they succeed. And that was definitely, I think that awareness wasn't quite there when I was going through my Marine Corps journey. I think we were still very much in the shadow of 9/11, and there was still very strong sentiments of not only patriotism, but a kind of, you know, the most mindless form of patriotism. Um, and it was difficult for me coming home, and difficult for a lot of other guys and girls that I worked. I worked entirely with men um, in Afghanistan, but later on, I met many women who had very similar experiences to my own. And yeah, it's hard to come home and kind of be faced with this kind of mass uh, naivety or disconnect or credulity on the part of not just strangers, like random people you're meeting, but also your own family members, your own friends. Um, that was tough. And I think that was the toughest thing for me, actually. It definitely created a gulf between myself and a lot of people I loved and still love. And it continues to in some ways, because the violence that I was a part of has continued. In some ways, it's even been exacerbated. I think what's been happening in Gaza is the next chapter. With the reason we got to a point where we've normalized what's happening in Gaza is because of this prehistory. It's because of 20 years of a so-called war on terror, where we were the ones ultimately who were terrorizing one population after another. It's Americans. I love my Americans in the way I love my America, because it's mine. It's all I know. But for a lot of reasons, I ended up getting a PhD in history because I was just so interested in knowing why. But Americans have a very difficult time looking their own country in the face, and particularly their own empire in the face. Even today, where we've been normalizing a genocide for 2 years straight, the word empire, imperialism are still, colonialism, all these words are still kind of like relegated to like leftist, activist, academic discourse, even though they're the most applicable words out there for what we've been seeing.
Yeah, the British, to their credit, called their empire the empire, and still,
Absolutely.
yeah, and still brag about it, are still bitter about losing it. But that's interesting. I'd
Yes.
love to hear about your thesis. What did you write your dissertation on?
So my dissertation, I mean, on the surface was very different. In some ways, I was kind of, I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to get paid money to read a bunch of books. And I was given the opportunity, so I took it. And I did want to read a lot of books about American violence and American war and ultimately American empire, because that's just where my headspace was when I got back. But at the same time, I think I felt a calling to do a dissertation that was separate from all that, because it was almost too overwhelming. Uh, maybe I just wasn't ready yet to write a whole book about war and violence and my own role in all that. So I actually wrote a dissertation on anti-capitalist and post-capitalist readings of Adam Smith
Ooh,
and liberal political economy. Because that was in part a result of my own story, because I was a strange mix of both a neoconservative war hawk and also some kind of like free market libertarian, which is totally contradictory, but it's what many people at that time were, certainly on the right. Um, so I read Adam Smith, I read Milton Friedman, I read all the right wing readers of Adam Smith while I was in high school and college. And just as I became disillusioned with U.S. foreign policy, I ended up becoming disillusioned with U.S. political economy and this kind of like just extreme version of capitalism that we have here. And I was in a class as a graduate student where we read some Adam Smith. We read other classical liberal political economists like John Stuart Mill. And it was just shocking, like reading them again or reading them in more depth and just seeing how far they were from like capitalist orthodoxy today. I mean, Mill, for starters, called himself a socialist, and he supported socialism. He was both a liberal and a socialist, and he was very open about this. He was about workplace democracy. He was about trade unionism. So that was Mill. Mill was in a lot of ways working from Smith. Smith was very much on the side of the workers, the farmers, the poor, and he was very much against and critical of the economic and political elites of his time. Really, all the elites of his time: the church elites, um, the trading elites, everyone. So, like, it's a really amazing story how this guy who was really writing a critique of this kind of emergent capitalist order. He never used the word capitalism. The word capitalism didn't come along until the mid 19th century. He was writing about what was the very beginnings of what we would now call capitalism, and he was very critical of it. And he was basically calling for kind of small scale checks and balances against larger scale emergent capitalist elites. Effectively, I mean that's what I read from reading him, and I think you can always read people in different ways. But so my dissertation is about how the early labor movement in the United States turned out a lot of them read Adam Smith in the same way, and that's what inspired them to unionize. Adam Smith famously said that employers are always creating their own concentration, their own combination, their own monopolies, and therefore workers. I mean, he more or less said that workers have no choice but to do the same.
Wow.
So they quoted him on this. I mean, there's the first real kind of union busting trial in 1806, 1807. It's been a few years since I wrote the dissertation, but it was actually very interesting. The lawyers on both sides of the argument quoted Adam Smith, but the defense, I think, much more effectively quoted Adam Smith on these questions. So yeah, and it goes well beyond the early labor movement, the populist movement in the late 19th century, the early progressive movement. They all saw Adam Smith as kindred spirit. Even many of the socialists, like self-avowed socialists, were pro Adam Smith. It wasn't until the beginning of really the first stage of the Cold War after the Russian Revolution that socialists and communists end up kind of adopting Lenin's view of all of liberalism as being pro-capitalist. But before then, it was an open question whether liberalism had to be in support of capitalism or not.
It's always whether it's Adam Smith, Jesus Christ. Yeah,
Yes.
these heroes that keep getting quoted on both sides. It's
Yes.
Schrodinger's figurehead.
I always joke. Sorry, just real quickly. I always joke
Please,
that
yeah.
that like right wingers always love to talk about how they're the big defenders of the West, and they're so pissed off that college students no longer read the great Western thinkers and writers. And my response is no, we are. You're right. We're no longer reading the great Western writers and thinkers. We should actually read them. In fact, we should start with you guys. You should actually read all these people that you pretend to worship. I think we'd be better off. I'm not someone who thinks that we should only read the great white men of history, but I think that would be a good start. That's certainly what all their critics later on, and all the radical critics of the Western tradition, they were actually reading these people. And I think all these right wingers that love to talk about the West, I think I encourage them, and I will join them in reading and writing about these great white men of history. we can learn a lot from them.
Yeah, I went to Columbia, and the irony of that being patient or yeah, ground zero for liberal indoctrination when that was the one time I read the New Testament. I grew up going to Jewish day school. I finally reached the
Yeah.
sequels. There's one moment in the book that I wanted to talk to you about. So I joke that the media loves war for the same reason I love musical theater, because it heightens emotions and provides dramatic visuals. And in your book, you write about a literal musical theater war connection. Tell us about
Yes.
River City. That is objectively hilarious.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. No one's ever brought up that part of the book. But yeah, River City was a term that we used in Afghanistan to describe a moment where all of our communications was shut down. So we had no means of communicating. Well, we were able to communicate with each other on classified lines or, um, encrypted lines, but we weren't able to speak to anyone back home or anyone outside our own kind of encrypted bubble. And the reason for that is because one of our own had been severely hurt or killed. And the military, to their credit, wanted to make sure that their loved ones received the message, in a professional and considerate manner, as opposed to just hearing it through hearsay. So this was always called River City. So whenever comms went down, this was more of an issue on the big bases because on the outposts, you didn't have the kind of comms to communicate with family anyway. But on the big bases, people would always complain when we were in River City because no one could like get on the internet or whatever. And, at the time, I'm like, I wonder why it's called River
Yeah.
City. And, I looked into it and, um, I haven't like found like total confirmation that it comes from the Music Man. But I think that's probably the best guess based on, it's been years since I've done the research for that as well. But it seems somewhat reasonable that it does come from Music Man and it comes from uh, one of the characters who's kind of like the main villain, who's kind of like a Pied Piper figure who's leading all these children to be part of this band. And he's telling all the parents that like once they learn these instruments, it's going to save all of them. There's going to be a bunch of money coming their way because there'll be these great musicians. And the parents basically like throw all this money at this guy. And he has a famous song where he references River City, and the language he uses, forgive me, I don't remember the exact part. It's been years since I wrote it or read my own book, but he uses language that almost sounds exactly like a military recruiter.
He says, you got
Yeah.
trouble right here in River City with a capital T that rhymes with P, which stands for pool. So he's saying he's recruiting the youths to join the
Yeah.
band so they don't get corrupted by billiards.
Yeah. Wow, I can tell you're very much a musical person. And I
Yeah,
should say, I
there's
mean,
we got my grandma's Fiddler on the Roof, a new musical original record right behind me. That's
wow,
yeah, and people still have the
amazing.
chutzpah to call me a bad Jew for being anti-genocide when I have
Ye-
Fiddler on the
ah,
Roof, a new
I love
musical.
it.
Oh,
I
thank you.
love it. I love it. Yeah. So I was a theater kid too. I mean, I've like part of me being in the Marines, I kind of divorced myself from my theater kid youth. But yeah, so we can go. That can be a whole other discussion on another
Yes,
day.
war
But
is
uh,
literal theater of war.
yeah. And I do have a whole section, not just on River City, but I talk about how I mean, so many of the rituals in the military, so much of the language, both the training language, the kind of like dormitory culture language we use, the language we use when we're in a war zone, when we're in combat. It's all straight from theatrical like vernacular.
Wow.
And even we're obsessed with costumes. I mean, Marines, if anything, we love to dress up in all sorts of costumes. Most famously, the dress blues for our our ball, our birthday ball every year. We have a script, a very theatrical script that we read every year. Everything is call and response. It's just so I have a whole section. I'm much more eloquent about it in the book. But yeah, no, it's an incredibly the military and the Marines. I can speak specifically with the Marines is not only like incredibly theatrical, but it's also incredibly queer.
Yeah,
And the
that's
two
fascinating.
are yeah, and the two are very related. So I get into that as well.
And I'd like to hear more about your anti-recruitment work that you mentioned earlier. So it is, yeah, how does that spiel go? Speaking of, are you still involved in anti-recruitment? Or what is it,
I
counter-recruitment?
counter recruitment and that they both work. I don't do it as much as I used to just because I'm pretty busy these days, but I still try to leave some time a year, portions of every year to do some of it, ideally in person, usually in New York City, but if not, then I'll do virtual visits to mostly high school classrooms, sometimes college classrooms, sometimes even like very rare, but sometimes graduate students, and then also, I mean, the graduate student thing is a little different because not no, none of those people usually are looking to. They're not being recruited at that point. So that tends to be a kind of different, uh, a different thing. But I even went to some middle schools, which was very difficult. I'm ambivalent about that, but high school was definitely an ideal place to go for counter recruitment because those are the people that are really getting recruited, particularly immigrant communities, particularly communities made up largely by the populations that we've been warring in. There were some schools in the Bronx and Queens that I've gone to multiple times where, if not a majority, certainly a plurality of the students were from Iraq, from
Wow.
Afghanistan, from Yemen, from Syria, from Somalia. Um, I mean, some of them you could go even back far, to past wars. Basically Vietnamese and all the rest. But certainly, like the military has made a deliberate decision to target these communities where you have it's a recycling of violence where you have all these children of refugees from the wars that we have led and continue, and prolonged, who come to America, and then basically the recruiters tell them and their kids that the best way to become Americans and to feel like you'll have a permanent home here is to join the military yourself. Um, and not only do they get additional soldiers this way or additional Marines this way, but they also get foot soldiers with language skills in the places that they are still warring in. So, this is a deliberate strategy for them to basically get more Arabic speakers in the military, more Pashto speakers in the military, more, whatever the language might be, more Farsi, Dari speakers. So yeah, I go to a lot of those schools as well. I think to kind of bring it back to the original question about safety,
Yeah.
this is something that I do really focus on in these settings because not always, but a lot of these schools I go to, a lot of the kids come from violent neighborhoods. They come from perhaps violent families, or they're just immersed in violent social media, violent culture as a whole. I mean, we're just a very violent country to begin with. And the men in particularly, these young men or boys, aspiring men is the way I kind of think about it. A lot of them think that they need to become men just like everyone else in their surroundings have become men, which means being violent in one way or another. Oh, I might not be the ideal messenger in these types of situations because I often don't come from the same background as a lot of these folks, but I still try to connect to them at that basic level because I think the one thing that we do share is a sense of real insecurity uh, in our own lives and a belief, at least at that point in our lives, that the way we can make ourselves more secure is by becoming more violent or at least more capable of committing violence or enduring violence. And the military doesn't just offer, I mean, it is a poverty draft in a lot of cases, or at least a working class draft, or, there's not much of a middle class in this country. So a lot of people that are middle class, technically middle class, a lot of them are joining the military because it's the only way they're insured healthcare and education and housing,
And that's by
long term
design.
too. I think I think there are certainly some people on the right that understand this dynamic, that understand that whenever there's full employment, I mean, I've seen people on the right write about this, that whenever there's full employment, whenever the government is being too social democratic, recruitment numbers go down. So there is an awareness of this. I think yeah.
And it's interesting, and they're using it to their benefit because it's now you can join ICE and get your students' loans
Yes,
forgiven.
exactly.
So yeah, I am interested in talking about violence overseas and whether or not that leads to violence at home. I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to talk about Charlie Kirk. We just watched. I saw the video. It popped up on my Instagram.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't stop thinking about it, and the fact that this, yeah, in America, the fact that if even fame and money can't protect you from gun violence, I'm gonna say it. I think maybe there should be fewer guns around.
That might be too extreme.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry,
Yeah,
but
I didn't know I was going on to such a radical venue.
exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, is there a connection in a society that praises war overseas? Is there a connection between seeing weapons of war on the streets at home?
yeah, I mean, there absolutely is. I can get into the weeds here about, various programs that have been in place, are still in place, where a lot of the surplus military gear, and particularly the weapons of the military, end up basically getting passed on to police precincts, uh, and then and basically all arms of the kind of carceral order. And then from there, they kind of trickle down to civilians and the society as a whole. I mean, there's just a major um, kind of I don't know what you would call it, like a shared ecosystem between military arms shipments and arm flows, carceral shipments and arm flows, and then civilian shipments and arm flows. They're all very, very connected. And the fact that we're both the most militarized country in the world, um, and also the most, certainly one of the most violent, the most, advanced rich country, I should just say rich country in the world. That's not a coincidence. Um, and you can speak very materially about that. You can talk about the arms flows and how that actually all works, and why there are just so many guns everywhere and every kind of gun. You can talk about the cultural flows that are happening. It's a very small step from cheerleading endless war abroad and then thinking, maybe violence is the answer at home too. Um, I mean, veterans in general, military people in general are like extremely overrepresented in mass shootings. Um, this is something that many prominent figures have denied through the years. And I understand the impulse there because you don't want to, because a lot of veterans struggle to get jobs because people are afraid. Well, maybe they're traumatized. Maybe they suffer from PTSD. So, like, I understand the impulse in denying or downplaying this. Um, I think we have to do both. We have to ensure that veterans are treated and that they are, employed and have basic income and everything they need to thrive. But we also have to be honest. And, when you train people to kill, when you send them abroad to kill, you can't just turn that off when they come home. Um, that is to use the word radical in a serious way now. I mean, that is a radicalizing experience. It radicalizes many, if not most people involved in it. And that radicalization can go in many different directions. I think I was radicalized to the left in many ways. I know a lot of other guys that were radicalized to the right, and a lot of them were radicalized just toward like an all-purpose nihilism. Um, so, I mean, there's just so many different ways to approach your question, but I think at this point, more and more Americans are seeing these connections, which I think there is some glimmer of hope there that at least more Americans are seeing it. But we're also at a time where we're living. The reason people are seeing it more is that we're living through kind of a culmination of all these terrible forces, um, playing out in real time, just day in and day out in one way or another. So it's very hard at this point for people to look the other way.
Yeah, it's the same. Uh, part of the reason why I started the podcast is because spent the last 2 years. I've never seen so many corpses on Instagram.
Yeah.
At either way, it's become impossible to ignore. And when you mentioned military equipment trickling down to civilians, if I recall correctly, isn't that how the Taliban got armed in the first place? They were armed by the United States against the Soviets.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely. I mean, the Cold War strategy, not just in Afghanistan, but uh, in Saudi Arabia, in Palestine, the Hamas, in a lot of ways, was a result of this same strategy. Was basically to arm and support and fund Islamist groups against secular leftist, communist, socialist groups across the greater Middle East. So this is what happened in Afghanistan. It was a very uh, self-conscious or conscious decision on the part of, well, beginning with the Carter administration, certainly the Reagan administration, to use Islamists. And by Islamists, I don't mean Muslims. I mean people who believe Islam should be the presiding governing structure of their country and maybe other countries as well. So it's kind of theocratic Islam, just like we have theocratic Judaism, theocratic
mhm.
Christianity. Um, to basically arm and fund these people as a counterweight to, in Afghanistan, explicitly the communists who had invaded and occupied Afghanistan. But in other places, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, it was more kind of subtle, more complicated situations. But again, it was about serving as a counterweight to secular leftist movements, pan-Arabist movements, pan-African movements that they saw as the main threat at the time. And this is another example of the recycling of violence, because then these people, we ended up funding for decades on end and arming for decades on end and training for decades on end. They then become our next chapter of villainy that we now have to fight a whole other decades-long war against.
Yes. So if not putting arms in the hands of people who can then use them against you, what does keep us safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think one book that really hit me hard when I got back from Afghanistan was actually Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Um, and she has this incredible formulation that I'll never forget and that I'll always return to, between thoughtlessness and evil. That basically Eichmann's major crime was not that he was, a cog in the machine, although that's part of the story. It's not that he was a bureaucrat, although that was part of the story. It's not that he was anti-Semitic, although that's part of the story. These are all true. But the fundamental crime that he committed, and that so many like him committed, and so many continued to commit, and when Arendt wrote her famous essay that turned into her book, it was actually serialized essay in the New Yorker. She had very much contemporaries in mind, and not contemporary neo-Nazis. Well, she had them in mind too, but she actually had in mind this emergent Zionist class, both in Israel and in the United States and Europe, that in some ways she was writing to. And she argues that the major crime with Eichmann and the major crime of so many other people like him and so many people that continue to be like him, including Jewish Zionists, that is the next chapter in this violence, is thoughtlessness. that they refuse to think. And the way she defines thinking is it's being able effectively to empathize with others and to contextualize the situations of others.
Now that's radical.
Um, yes, yes. I mean, this term radical empathy in some ways. I think there's a Arendtian connection there, but and to see them, truly see them, and feel other people as fully human humans. Um, and to share, she even says that the great crime of thoughtlessness is the refusal to share the earth with others. I'm paraphrasing, but she has a line about sharing the world.
Wow.
And that Eichmann's great crime, this is like the end of the book. It's been many years since I've read it, but like, she, her last line is controversial because she actually is justifying this one act of the death penalty. She ends up supporting him getting executed. And she says, and that's why he must die. It's
Wow.
because he refused to share it. So it's a very, it's full of contradiction, and it's ripe for debate. But the part of that book that really struck me was this equation of thoughtless. Real evil is not, just it's not sociopathy. It's a much more common, mundane thoughtlessness that so many of us end up, being entrapped by. Yeah.
Yeah, that book is. It's been a while since I read it as well, but I remember to like put it in internet parlance. Like, yeah, Adolf Eichmann, literally just some guy. He was
Yeah.
a vacuum oil salesman who was like, all right, I guess this is the way to move up in the world. This is how I get my career. And we see now how it literally could be anybody. It's
So I just realized I didn't answer your question. So for me, if we really want to be safe, we have to begin by really thinking in the terms that Arendt demanded of us. We have to think seriously about root causes, why people behave the way they do, what truly is going to help them and others behave in ways that are more peaceful and more healthy for all involved, instead of just thoughtlessly, time and again, reaching for a weapon of one kind or another. Because while you can certainly come up with scenarios in which you do have to pick up this or that weapon, the overwhelming majority of our problems are not because we're refusing to pick up weapons. It's because our first instinct is to pick up the weapons.
yes, I
And
believe.
yeah.
I believe you mentioned in the book. I hadn't known this until I read the book, but that the Taliban offered bin Laden after 9/11 in
Yes.
exchange for not invading. So none of that. It's analogous to Israel and Hamas, as everyone's saying, like, well, what are you supposed to do after 1,200
Yeah.
people are killed? Not kill hundreds of thousands of people? Like, no, there
Yes.
are quite literally other ways to do things. So yeah, that's devastating that
Yeah, I mean, actually, we could go to Palestine just real quickly because the real scholars. There's a great book um, called what is it called? Hamas Contained. Yes. Oh, so I think Baconi's book is, in my opinion, the best book ever written on, or at least um, the most in depth, up to date book on Hamas and the history. And what's clear after reading that book is that there were so many opportunities, and in fact, they remain to this day. So, because Baconi has been interviewed many, many times and written a lot since that book came out, and he's kind of given updates to Hamas and to the wider political climate in Palestine, and particularly in Gaza. But there's just been opportunity time and again for Hamas to basically come to some type of, at the very least, modus operandi, or some kind of modus vivendi, some kind of like coexistence with Hamas. There's no doubt that Hamas, when they first started, were as radical as one could be, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the beginning, and there was also a lot of theocracy in the beginning. But through the years, they become more secular. They've become more accommodating, more willing to compromise. And there's also just many different. They've like every other political organization or every other political movement. As they've grown, they've become more contested, and they've matured in a lot of ways. So they followed the path of basically every militant movement in history. Um, and it's just very clear once you finish this book, and I could give a lot of other book recommendations as well, but I think this is again the most in depth, that Hamas is not it's there are elements of it that you cannot negotiate with, but the presiding element, certainly like before October 7th, um were accommodationist. I mean, you had the whole um the March of Return that happened, and they were just you basically had it was a totally peaceful effort, and they were just getting sniped one after another. This is like Gazans that are trying to like peacefully protest their own, not only their own occupation, but their own like apartheid like brutalization. That was being led by Hamas. So this is like a peaceful effort that went on for quite some time. They had a peaceful strategy for basically most of the decade preceding October 7th. And in a lot of ways, that was the problem in the eyes of the Israeli right, is that their main opponent was being too accommodating. They were being too peaceful. So they had to change that. And I could go on and on about this, but the point is, it's a very complex organization. There's many different factions within it. And yes, if the Israelis were governed by a more reasonable, truly peace-loving, ruling class, there were so many opportunities in which they could have gone in much more peaceful, less horrifying directions.
Yeah, there's a quote I'm about to butcher, but I think, was it JFK who said, like, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable? Like, by
Right.
treating peaceful protest like violent protest, it just incentivizes people like, well, fuck it, might as well be violent.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that goes back to war not keeping us safe. War just creates more.
Yeah, I mean, the other point that I make in these kind of recruitment sessions at like a very like personal, interpersonal level, the more like aggressive and masculine and violent you become, the more you put your own self in danger.
Wow, yes.
I mean, when I go to a bar, the chances of me getting hurt are nil to none, because I do not put myself in situations where I am going to get in a bar fight. I do not go to kinds of bars where there's often bar fights. If I do go to one, I'm very cautious about how I behave. But the people that are obsessed with protecting themselves in very like violent, aggressive manners, they end up making themselves targets time and again, because they make enemies time and again. They are constantly making enemies, and they are constantly creating situations that do become violent, and that end up reinforcing their insecurities, because they're they're in another violent situation, they get hurt again or whatever, and then they feel like they need to man up even more. And in a lot of ways, this is a microcosm for American history as a whole. We are a profoundly insecure country. That's why we talk about national security all the time. It's why we talk about national defense all the time. It's why we talk about self-defense all the time. We never feel protected. We never feel secure. And because of that, we are always lashing out. We are always trying to preempt, supposed aggressions on the part of others. And in the process, we create enemies, and we create more and more war and more havoc, both within our nation and abroad.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear. I know you're in Michigan now, so that you don't go to bars with Ohio State gear on. Like, you know better. People should just.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in my youth I would have. I actually just went to my first Michigan game the other day. It was incredible. I highly recommend it. It's the biggest stadium in the country, third biggest stadium in the world, behind one in North Korea and one in India.
Wow.
Yes, and it's amazing. So I'm happy I ended up here. I'm going back to school to get into sustainable supply chains, operations, finance. So yeah, that's why I'm here, and I'm enjoying it. But that's a whole other. You can cut that. I don't know how relevant it is to this discussion. But go
No, that's
blue.
yeah, no, that's amazing. And I was gonna ask, I has your military experience and subsequent anti-militarist views affected your ability to enjoy sports and pop culture? Because I went to the Mets game yesterday. Let's go Mets! And there wasn't a flyover, but you always feel like you gotta stand and salute. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm eating donuts, man. Like, why you gotta bring foreign policy into this?
Yeah. No. Totally. No. I mean, there's a um, sports in the United States, as in all empires, is very much a political affair. It became even far more of a political affair after 9/11, and it stayed that way. In some ways, it's got even more ridiculous. Um, there's no doubt about it. And yeah, for many years, I that really did bother me. Um, but I don't know. I mean, part of my own kind of post-war, I guess my own kind of healing process, I've had to kind of make peace, I guess, in a way, with these unfortunate political situations that there's just no way I can avoid them. So, like ultimate fighting, for instance, like I mean, like I have a lot of friends in the Marine Corps. I have a lot of friends that I met in the military, the wider military, who love UFC. They love mixed martial arts and all the rest. Like, do I see a lot of that as like part and parcel of the problems we're talking about? Yes. But at the same time, I've come to admire the discipline involved, the skill involved. And I think there are certainly fighters out there that it's a healthy form of sublimation. I mean, they are not going off and beating up and killing other people. This is their one space where they kind of get to let all that out. They're very disciplined about it. I don't think that's always the case. Like I said, I think often and you could say the same for football, these very violent sports, the violence, it's hard to contain within the sporting venue. But I've become more open-minded about that, I guess. I don't know if that's what you were asking, but you kind of have to meet people halfway, I guess, on a lot of these things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do want to ask because in your book, it's like a fascinating chronicle of someone who had their entire worldview shaken, and we're living in what feels just unsustainable. Like something has to change. Or so. Do you have any advice for people going through their their own unbecoming? Because I grew up in a very right wing Zionist community. It's still very right wing Zionist. I just left. Uh,
Yeah.
I moved. I'm in Brooklyn now, but even Manhattan Jews is also a different. You
Yeah.
cross the river and it's different. Do you have any advice for people who might be going through their unbecoming?
Well, first of all, solidarity with you. I come from a liberal Zionist family, so I've been able to um, stay close to my family. It's been difficult. There's been some tough moments. There's still some tough moments, but I imagine whatever you're going through is a lot worse. So solidarity.
Oh,
I
thank
mean, I
you.
don't know. Yeah, yeah. Um,
I got my parents. We
I
agreed that bad things are bad, which is huge.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's a big step forward. Yeah. um, you know, I think I'm still learning this. I'm still failing at it, but I think the goal has to be to maintain one's integrity while also keeping channels open with those you really care about and those that you really love and people that at the end of the day love you and care about you. Um, I know sometimes that's impossible. You can't do both and you have to choose. And sometimes it's unclear whether the people in your lives really do love and care about you. And I think I've been lucky in that sense that I've always been certain that those that I've had political disagreements with, because I did become very much like a leftist in a
Hmm.
society that is not leftist. Um, uh, there have been moments that have been very difficult, but I always knew that those closest to me loved me and cared about me and were good people, despite the major political gulfs. And so I've made it a priority just to always remind myself of that and to always keep the channels open, even when it gets really ugly and nasty. And, everyone's going to have to, there's no easy answer here. I mean, sometimes I know friends of mine that have had to cut off like just total relations with like family members, not just on the Gaza issue, but all sorts of things. Like I have like gay friends of mine, for instance, that come from like right-wing families. It was just too difficult for them to maintain relationships with family members that were opposed to who they were, that very essence of who they were. So I don't want to seem like I'm like giving like an answer to this question. I don't think there is an answer,
Or
but for me, yeah,
That's great. Find your people is very important advice. And
yeah,
incidentally, that sounds like one of the reasons why a lot of people join the military to begin with, to find their people and to find the sense of community. But it doesn't have to be the military or uh, or Zionism or conservatism. There's plenty of ways to organize a community.
yeah. And it doesn't, like you said, I mean, it doesn't have to be, where you came from. Sometimes the people that are really going to love you and support you and that you're going to feel most at home with are people that you meet later in your life. But I guess for me, like, I do think most people have a hard time making sense of politics
Hmm.
and political questions. And I've always thought really, really hard about political questions, even when I was on the wrong side of these debates. But like most people just don't. They kind of just go with the flow. They just accept whatever the person to their right and the left, is saying or thinking. And yeah, I don't think that's ever going to change, unfortunately. And that's where people are really complex, is that they don't mean to be adopting a politics that's like truly murderous and evil. They don't see it that way. They don't feel it that way. And they're incredibly kind and thoughtful to everyone around them. And they might love you and care about you. And, that's just like the human predicament is like, what do we do with this?
Yeah, I guess start a podcast.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
when in doubt, or write a
Write a
truly
book, write a memoir. Yeah.
exactly a truly excellent book. So that seems like a great place. Where can people find you? Is there anything you'd like to plug in addition to the book, which available wherever books are sold in
Well,
audiobook as well?
yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, you can purchase the book, I think, in most places still, I think. Like, I mean, certainly Amazon, but like the independent, like, websites and independent bookstores, you could probably ask them to order. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, my book came out a few years ago, and I just like I'm not as
It's
keyed
definitely
into.
still at the Brooklyn Public Library. I confessed before we
Yeah,
started
okay, yeah, a
recording.
lot of the libraries, yeah, thankfully it is in a lot of the libraries. So yeah, definitely recommend going to the libraries. And no one needs to buy my book. I'm not depending on that as a source of income. It's very hard to make money as a writer these days, even if you write a good book that's well received. So that's not where I'm getting my income. And so yeah, definitely use the library. Huge supporter of public libraries. And then as far as anything else to plug, you keep on joking about your own podcast, but I actually have a podcast with another veteran friend of mine. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, he's a Air Force intelligence vet, and he has a PhD in international relations. And I think he's one of the best, smartest, most knowledgeable kind of international relations commentary people out there. He actually worked in the Obama administration. He advised a number of high-profile politicians, including Bernie at one point. His name's Van Jackson. So I'm very honored for him to be my co-host. We have a podcast called Bang Bang, which is also directly from my book. Bang Bang is one of the many kind of sexualized terms that we used, to describe like getting some, basically killing people or getting in a firefight. But it also, bing bang, can also mean one's penis. I mean, it has so many different sexual connotations. And we basically talk about war movies, and that's kind of a ongoing theme, is how most war movies have are just like hypersexualized. Um, and we just return to one movie after another and just kind of talk about not just the hypersexualization, although that's often a theme, but a lot of the stuff that we've talked about during this discussion. It's a kind of critical take on popular cinema, not so popular cinema, everything in between, classics, independent, foreign, movies that we love, movies that we hate, movies we're not sure about, new movies, old movies, but all in one way or another having to do with war and violence.
That's amazing. You should do a Music Man episode.
Yeah, actually, that's a great. Maybe we can have you come on. We're always looking for new guests.
Oh my gosh, I would love to. I'd be honored.
Yeah, we'd love to have you. Yeah. I'll send you an invite afterward.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, just to tie things back to theater kids. The one musical that reading about imperialism has ruined for me is Rodgers and Hammerstein's South Pacific. It's like the score is so beautiful. It's during World War II in the South Pacific, but like what is the Frenchman doing running a plantation in the South Pacific? So sometimes you got to turn your brain off.
Yeah, thankfully, most of the musicals I ended up doing as a kid, at least at first, kind of off the cuff, I don't think any of them were like particularly like imperialist, but I'm sure they were the more I think about it. But South Pacific is not one I ever did, and I don't know much about that, but I'm familiar enough that that's funny. I mean, that is funny. I could see someone who was really into that being really depressed after reading like Greg Grandin or Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz or something. Yeah.
But yeah, you just sometimes you got to separate the art from the artist and enjoy some Enchanted Evening by Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Actually, I should say my first musical ever was The Wiz, and The Wizard of Oz was written by a racist, nationalist, kind of imperialist guy. I'm forgetting his name now.
L. Frank Baum.
Yeah.
Oh,
He was also a populist. He was kind of like many populists at the time. Like he was very critical of like the capitalist elites of his time, but he was also incredibly racist. And I think he was also an imperial. He certainly believed in like getting rid of the Indians and just like taking over the entire continent.
Well, that's so funny to know that even though his state is probably benefiting from Wicked, he'd absolutely hate for it to be an allegory for fascism.
Right. All right. Well, on that lovely note, thank you so much, Orli. I appreciated this.
Of course. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review. Tell your dads. We'll see you next time.